Debugging. I know sounds like a boring topic, but if you ever made a game, you know how easy it is to get errors and bugs. Luckily, GameMaker has some really useful debugging tools to help you figure out why you're getting errors and what's causing your bugs. Hey there, this is GameMaker Station, and in today's video we are taking a look at GameMaker Studio 2's debugger. In your project, you can click on this button here to start the game in debug mode, or just hit F6 on your keyboard. And if you're doing this for the first time, it may ask you for firewall permissions, so you need to allow that. Your game should then open with the debugger in the GameMaker IDE. In the debugger here, you can see your graph with the memory usage and FPS, so you can monitor your performance. I'm going to click here to pause the game because that's when the debugger can show us the most info. And here you can see the code and the exact line where we happen to pause our game. Now this button here takes you through the code line by line, so I'll press it a few times just so it can initialize these variables. And now let's look at the 4 debugger tabs at the bottom. First of all, we have the variables tab. On the left, we have all the variables that are local to this piece of code. So at the top level, you're gonna see any local variables that you initialized using var. Under self, you're going to see all the instance variables that are in the current instance. And under other, you have the variables for the other instance, which is usually used in collision events and with statements. Then in the middle here, you have all of your global variables. And on the right, you have the watch window. Here you can enter any variable or expression. You can even run functions on your variables, and you will see their values on the right side. This is useful if you want to keep track of certain variables and see how they change in relation to your code. What's great is that you can also change the values of your variables here. This can be very useful for testing if you want to change some variables at runtime. Now if you have a variable that holds a data structure, it's not going to show its contents by default. You'll only see its ID. So you can right click, go under View As, and here select your data structure. After you do that, you'll see the contents of this data structure. You'll also notice that we have instance in this list. So if a variable holds an instance ID, you can select this option to see the variables of that instance. The next tab here is instances. On the left, you're seeing all the instance variables that belong to the current instance. Here you also have the same option to view a variable as a data structure. In the middle, you're seeing all the instances that exist in the room with their instance IDs and object names, and you can open any of them and see their variables. On the right, you have the selected instance window. This is quite interesting. While your game is paused, you can click on any instance in the game window, and that instance will be shown here. Let's move to the other tab now. On the left here, you have the profiler, which shows you how much time each script or event is taking. So you can start profiling, then play your game, and it will start collecting information about the game's performance. You can then pause the game and take a look at the stats in the profiler. Here we have our events and functions listed. You can sort it by how many calls there were, the time it took in microseconds, or how much of the step it took as a percentage. You can also open some events in this list to see its functions and how much time they each take. Right now we are using the top-down option here, but if you use bottom-up, it's going to show you the individual functions first instead of showing the events first. Now because of this option, you are seeing the average values for all the stats, which are per frame. So you can disable this and see the total values for the stats since the profiler was started. Now all we are seeing here is my code, but you can also see the engine code or both of them combined. If you do this, you may notice that this finished frame item takes so much of the step. You may worry that it will slow down your game, but that's actually not the case. This is simply showing you how much of your step is spent not doing anything. So in this case, it's simply empty for 95% of a step. Now other than the profiler, here we have a section for buffers. If you're using buffers in your game, you can see them here. And I found this useful when I was working on networking in a project to see the buffers that were being sent and received. Finally, here we have the graphics section where you can see your surfaces and textures, but we are not going to go through this since the topic of our video mainly has to do with code errors. So let's begin with exactly that, but not before taking a look at today's sponsor, this guy. Wait, that's me. If you want to learn a lot more about GameMaker using GML, you can get my crafting course on Udemy. This 6-hour course takes you through making a survival game where you can collect resources and craft more items. There will be a limited discount coupon in the description. And now let's continue with the video. Sometimes you can find that your game doesn't even start, or it does start, but at some point it freezes. This mostly happens because of an infinite loop, where your for loop or while loop just doesn't stop. This can easily be debugged by running the game in debug mode, and then pausing it, which will show you exactly where the program is stuck. You can then go through that code line by line by clicking on this button that says Step into Function Call. This will basically take you through how the program executes each line. And there are two more similar buttons here that we'll take a look at later in this video. Now as you go through the code, you can keep looking at the value of any variable by hovering over it or looking into the variables tab. And you can also add the variable into the watch section here and see its value change over time. As I mentioned previously, you can also manually change the value here. So for example, my loop is stuck because I have a for loop inside another for loop where they are both using the same loop variable, which is I. This means that I is always reset within the main loop, so it never reaches 3 and the loop never stops. So now I know what the problem is and I can fix my code, but right now, to break out of this loop, I'm going to go into the watch window and set I to 3, then hit play, and the game is not frozen anymore because the loop has ended. So whenever you find a freeze in your game, just run it in debug mode and go through it line by line while looking at your variables. By the way, let me know in the comments if your game has ever frozen and how you fixed it. Now we're going to look at what these stepping buttons do. Here I have some code and I want to step through it line by line, but it doesn't have any errors or freezes. So to make the debugger stop here manually, I'm going to add a breakpoint on this line by clicking here. You can also hit F9 to add a breakpoint. So now in debug mode, whenever the program comes to this line, it will pause the game and we can take a look at our code. Also note that this only works in debug mode, so breakpoints wouldn't pause your game if you ran it normally. I'll run it in debug mode now, and when it starts, it automatically pauses on that line and opens that event in the debugger. Now let's see what these 3 buttons do. The first one, Step into Function, simply takes you through each line of code, including all of the code within functions. So now it's taking me through the events, and then through this function, and when we are done, we are back into the event. Then we have the Step Over Function button. This also takes you through each line of code, but it doesn't go inside functions. So it's taking me through each line, and when it comes to the function, it doesn't go inside it, it simply steps over it. Now the third button, Step Out of Function, is simply used to come out of a function if you're inside one. So I'll use the first button to go through each line and enter this function, and now I can press the Step Out of Function button to come out of the function immediately. So as you do all of this, as you go through each line of your event, you can make use of all of these tools down here that we looked at before, and you can also hover over any variables and see their values. This can be very useful to figure out how your code works and what it's doing, so you could fix bugs or optimize your code or do anything else. Now we paused our debugger manually using a breakpoint, but it also pauses automatically when you get an error. So I don't have any breakpoints in this event, but I do have an error. I'll run it in debug mode. We see the error message, and the debugger opens the event where we have the error and highlights that line. Down here you'll see your call stack, so you can know exactly which scripts and events led to this error. And again, you can make use of all of the tools down here and look at your variables. If you need to know exactly how it got to this error, you could add a breakpoint a few lines before the broken statement and step through it line by line so you can see exactly what's happening on each line. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions and what you think of the debugger. You can find a limited discount coupon to my crafting course in the description. And that's all for this video. Make sure to check out my other tutorials and don't forget to subscribe as I'm always making more content. Thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next video.